So my name is Melissa Aikens. I am an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of New Hampshire, where I'm a discipline-based education researcher. And first of all, I want to thank the Allen Institute for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited to talk about my research today. And second, I'd like to thank the Allen Institute for hosting this conference, because it's been a great opportunity to talk with others, think about open science, both from a research and from a practitioner perspective. So I'm going to start my talk with a little bit of a confession. I study quantitative skills, but I'm not actually one of those people that loves math. I don't hate math. I'm more math ambivalent. Growing up, it was always fine to do math in math classes, but I wasn't thinking about math otherwise, and that's because I was going to become a biologist. At first, I was going to become the kind of biologist that cured cancer, but over time, I developed a deep love of ecology, and so I decided I was going to become a field biologist. And so eventually, I went off to graduate school, and I studied plant ecology and evolutionary biology. And in my first month of graduate school, I had to read Landy and Arnold's seminal paper on the measurement of selection, which introduced equations on the third page and subsequently built them to culminate in a multivariate regression equation that measures selection on correlated characters. I had to read and lead a discussion on vole population dynamics that included, among other things, a sine function to model oscillating population sizes over time. And I was taking a population biology class. And so I was learning about Leslie matrices. And so I had to be able to do matrix algebra and calculate eigenvalues, all to predict future population size. And so it quickly became apparent to me that math was going to become a significant part of my graduate studies in biology. So I actually ended up loving population biology, and I even leaned into the math, and I did some mathematical modeling for my dissertation. And while I can't say that I ever really loved doing the math, I did develop a deep appreciation for the role of mathematics in biology, for how biological variables could be translated into mathematical equations that could then lead insight into biological phenomena. So after I graduated, I really wanted teaching experience, and so I applied for some adjunct teaching positions, and I got an interview at a college, and they asked me to do a teaching demo for an introductory biology course on a topic of my choice. Well, I just studied population biology for 5 years, so I decided I was going to do population growth. And I included, for better or worse, these continuous population growth equations in my lecture. And at the end of this lecture, I was talking to the search committee, and they said, maybe not exactly, but pretty much, you can't include those equations in the class. They're too hard for our students. And I was taken aback by this. I realize quantitative skills are challenging, but shouldn't we be trying to challenge our students, right? And also, shouldn't we be putting these into the introductory courses so that they actually have time to build these skills while they're undergrads? And so it turns out I wasn't the only one thinking this way. In the early 2000s, several editorials were published that called for more mathematical training of life science students. And between 2003 and 2011, several national reports on undergraduate biology education were published, right, including Vision and Change, all of which called for life science students to learn competencies in quantitative skills. And so I do want to acknowledge that I've kind of talked about quantitative skills from this lens of mathematical modeling, but I want to emphasize that quantitative skills are actually much broader than that. It includes really anything where you are thinking about and reasoning with numbers. And so it includes things like understanding stats, so being able to conduct and interpret statistical analyses, even being able to construct and interpret graphs of quantitative data. And all of these skills are important for biologists, right? Whether you're a neurobiologist, a cell and molecular biologist, an ecology and evolutionary biologist, even a doctor, because these skills are critical for being able to read and interpret scientific papers. They're critical for being able to work with data, even for being able to calculate the correct drug dosage. for patients. And so while my journey started here, I'm actually interested in how students can learn all of these skills. So in thinking about how we build quantitative skills in life science students, one thing that's really important to understand are the cognitive processes students are using when they're trying to solve quantitative problems, right? How are they doing this? And so you can take a sense-making perspective and think about how are they making sense of the math, how are they making sense of the biology. You can think about the productive resources or knowledge elements that they're applying to solve these problems. But I also think it's important to understand how we can get students engaged with these problems, which means thinking about this from a motivational perspective. And this is where my research actually started. And that's because I was teaching introductory biology. I had quantitative assignments. I would give them to the students to work on in class. And there were always a subset of students who were not really engaged. And I would always go up and I would ask, how can I help you? And they would just shrug their shoulders and say, I'm not a math person. And I found this troubling because if you weren't going to engage in these tasks that were designed to help you learn these skills, how are you going to learn these skills? And so I think it's important that we understand students' self-beliefs for quantitative tasks, such as their confidence in their abilities to do quantitative tasks, their mindsets around quantitative tasks, as well as their values for quantitative tasks. And ultimately, what I hope to do is better understand what we can do in the classroom. So thinking about curriculum materials, thinking about teaching strategies, even thinking about the climate we're creating in our classroom, how what we can do there can get students engaged with those quantitative problems and making sense of them in a way that helps them successfully solve them. So today, I am actually going to talk about this pathway. I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing, thinking about this from a motivation perspective. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief overview of the motivation theory that guides my research. And then I'm going to talk about 3 studies that I've done. So one, looking at students' perceptions really of the relevance of math to biology. One that kind of tries to dig into how students build their confidence for quantitative tasks. And then this is a very recent, as in we're currently doing, study where we're looking at how course components relate to students' values and confidence for programming tasks. And we are thinking about statistical programming using R for data analysis. And finally, I'll wrap up with some implications for teaching. All right, so let's think for a minute about what motivates students to engage with a task. In other words, what motivates students to put effort into a task and to persist on that task even when it becomes challenging? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a quantitative problem from an introductory biology textbook. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read that problem and think to yourself all of the reasons why students might engage with that kind of task if you ask them to, or why they might not engage with that task if you ask them to. And then we'll do a little pair and then a share out, all right? So you have 30 seconds. Why might students engage with this task? Why might they not on your own? All right, what I want you to do is I want you to chat with someone next to you. Why might students engage with this task? Why might students not engage with this task? All right, I'm going to bring us all back together. Does anyone want to volunteer to share a reason why a student might engage with a task or not engage with this task? Sam. Oh. Making the runners earn their job.
Thank you. So I teach a lot of students who've had AP experience, and they see this, and they know the equation, and they kind of know what to do with it, so some of them jump right in.
Yeah, so some of them feel like they have those resources that they're able to like activate, right, productively. And so there's a cognitive component involved in this. There has to be, you know, some knowledge might help them like really do it. And if they don't feel like they know how to do it at all, I mean, how are they going to solve this, right? So there's definitely a cognitive component here. What else? What's another reason why they might or might not engage?
We were just thinking that if a student was particularly interested in the genetic basis of disease, they might be interested in performing this task.
All right, so the context of the task might be really important for generating interest. One more. Come on. I know it's after lunch. We're all tired.
On the other hand, if students are interested in the biology aspect of it, the math might be stumping them from preventing them from pursuing this problem further because they just don't like math.
Yeah, so they could be opposite, right? They might see the math and just be like, oh no, nope. Some people might have math anxiety, see those numbers and be like, whoa, no, that's definitely not for me, right? So there are motivational elements too, right? There also could be motivational elements in terms of what if this was for credit, right? And a grade's attached to this. That's an incentive to do this. Or what if this is on an exam preview for some, right? Which we just talked about. And they know it's going to be on an upcoming exam, right? So there's some motivation to do that kind of task in that situation. So there's lots of different motivational theories out there. The one that guides my research is expectancy value theory. This theory posits that students' expectancies of success on a task and their values for a task are going to affect the effort they put into that task and their persistence on that task. So expectancies of success, this is just the extent to which a student believes they can do a task. So you can imagine if a student thinks they can do a task, yeah, they're just going to kind of keep working on it until it gets done. Whereas a student who does not think they can do a task, they are much more likely to just give up as soon as it becomes difficult to them. But even if a student thinks they can do a task, it doesn't mean they're automatically going to do it, right? And so this theory posits that there has to be some value in that task for them. So there are 4 values. The first is intrinsic value. This is the interest or enjoyment a student gets from a task. So any task that a student might find interesting, enjoyable, that's going to have high intrinsic value. Utility value is a student's perceptions of the usefulness of that task for something in the future. So a task that helps a student learn something that's going to be on an upcoming exam can have high utility value. A task might have high utility value if it helps them learn something that they need to know for another class that they have to take. Or a task might have high utility value if it helps them learn something they know, that they need to know for their career, right? So that's an extrinsic motivating factor. Attainment value is the importance of doing well on a task, so often thought about in terms of, oh my gosh, how important are those grades for you? But it can also be thought about in terms of identity. So for example, a person who thinks of themselves as a math person, it might be really important for them to do well on math tasks because that reaffirms that math identity, and to not do well would threaten that math identity. And then the last task values, this one's different. This one is called cost. It encompasses all of the negative aspects of engaging in a task. And so it includes things like stress and anxiety that's induced by a task, or maybe extra effort or time that has to be spent to doing a task. So there have been lots of studies that have looked at the relationship between expectancies of success, task values, and student achievement in a number of contexts. And one of the most famous was done by Chris Holloman and colleagues with high school science students. And they randomized the high school science students into 2 groups, a control group, where students had assignments where they had to summarize the science material that they were learning in class. And a treatment group called the relevance group, where students had assignments where they had to explain the usefulness of the science material to their own lives. So this is essentially trying to emphasize that utility value of that science material. And so the researchers gathered the grades at the end of the term, and this is from their paper. And so you can see grade here on the y-axis on a 4-point scale. We have students in the control group represented by the blue bars, students in the treatment group represented by the white bars. But what you can see is the impact of that treatment depends on students' expectations of success in that course. If students had low expectations of success in their science course, they thought they were not going to do well. Being in this treatment group, thinking about that utility value significantly increased their grades over those of the control students. However, if students thought they were going to do well in that class, they had high expectations of success, that treatment did not have any significant impact. So I like this study for a couple of reasons. First, it nicely demonstrates how values can relate to grades and perhaps even interact with expectancies of success. But I also really like it because it shows us that there are things that we can do in our classroom that can actually impact students' values and ultimately lead to better student performance. So because there have been studies looking kind of at this part of the pathway, at expectancies of success, values, and student achievement, I've done a lot of stuff kind of on this part of the pathway, thinking about what we're doing in the classroom and how does it relate to students' expectancies of success? How does it relate to students' values? So what I'm going to do is talk about my first study now. And this was a study where we were trying to promote students' perceptions of the utility value of math to biology. So their understanding of why math is useful in the field of biology. And this was done with an interdisciplinary biomath course. So given that quantitative skills are so important to our discipline, we often require students who are life science majors to take some type of quantitative course as part of their degree requirements. Sometimes this is a calculus course, sometimes it's a stats course, sometimes students get to choose, right? But presumably it's some course that's very important for their development as biologists. However, the amount of biology that's in these courses can vary, particularly if these courses are taught through math departments. And so if there's not a lot of biology in there, it makes it hard for the students to understand why they're taking that course. And we really run this risk of them seeing it as kind of this box to check, right? Rather than some course that's going to impart valuable skills for their discipline. So my colleagues, Dr. Carrie Diaz-Eaton, who was formerly at Unity College and is now at Bates College in Maine, and Dr. Hannah Highlander at the University of Portland, they knew well the challenges of teaching these courses. They are mathematical biologists, and they were tasked with teaching a required calculus course for the life science students at their respective institutions. And very quickly, they became dissatisfied with this traditional calculus curriculum. And so they decided they were going to revamp their calculus courses into biocalculus courses, where they looked at calculus as the study of change, and they were using mathematical models to solve biologically based problems. But Carrie and Hannah went a step further. And what they did was they really tried to design their course around the interests of their particular students. And they were at very different institutions. So even though they were teaching generally the same kinds of calculus concepts, they were doing so with very different activities and in very different contexts. And so as an example, at Unity College, most of the life science students there are focused on ecology and the environment. And so Carrie, for teaching discrete time models, developed an activity where they had to look at population growth, stocking, and harvesting of fish in a land trust lake. Whereas Hannah's students were largely pre-med. And so there, when she was teaching discrete time models, she had an activity where they were looking at change in chemical concentration within the human lung, right? In other words, from an anatomy and physiology perspective. And so this afforded us the opportunity to ask, how does a biocalculus course impact biology students' utility value for mathematics? So to address this, Carrie and Hannah did pre and post surveys over multiple years with these classes. And actually, these surveys were quite extensive because they were interested in many things. So we only analyzed the items that were relevant to our research question about utility value. And so they had 3 Likert type items that were related to utility value. The skills I learned in this class will help me in other classes for my major. Mathematics is important for my chosen profession. And the skills I learned in this class will help me in my career after college. And so students had to rate their agreement on a scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. There was also an open response on both the pre and the post survey. In your opinion, is the knowledge of mathematics beneficial to biologists? Why or why not? And so our final sample included only life science students or pre-med students. And so the first thing we did was we looked at the quantitative data. We analyzed these 3 items separately. And so here are the 3 items, pre and post on the x-axis. And the mean score on the y-axis, remember this is going to be on a scale from 1 to 5. And we actually found the same result for all 3. So let's do a little quick poll. How many of you think we found significant increases in utility value? Why is nobody raising their hand? Okay. How many of you think we found significant decreases in utility value? Okay, no cynics. How many of you think we found no change? All right, so we in fact found no change, none, okay? So even though Carrie and Hannah had redesigned this entire course to emphasize like the utility value of calculus, not just to biology, but to like the interests of the students, we found no change in utility value. But very importantly, look at this. Look how high this is coming in, right? So students are coming in with pretty high utility value, 4 on average on a scale from 1 to 5. So we learned a little bit more by looking at the open response data. And so we inductively coded students' responses where they had to explain how math is beneficial to biology. And we came up with several different categories for how we could code student responses. These are loosely arranged from kind of more broad and vague to more specific down at the bottom. But we had students whose responses were categorized as broad utility, where they talked about how math is so useful for daily life or science and never once mentioned anything about biology, even though that was the question. We had students who also had a really vague response, and they would talk about how, oh yeah, math is really useful for understanding biology concepts, or math is really useful for understanding microbiology, or math is really useful for doing research, but they gave us no other information, like so vague. We had students who talked about how math is useful for understanding the chemistry that's needed for biology. And we did have some students talk about how math is useful for doing calculations in biology. We had a category called general analytical skills. This is where our students talked about how math was really useful for helping them develop problem solving or critical thinking or reasoning skills they would need as a biologist. But the last 2 categories are where we got more specific. And so in science process skills, here students talked about the specific things they were doing with math when they were doing research. And in specific applications, they'd talk about the specific things that require, like specific problems that required math. Classic example, population growth, right? So this is the data for the pre-survey. So this is the percentage of responses that had each code attached to it. And just to note, a response could potentially have multiple codes if it did actually, like for instance, if they talked about some specific science process skill and they're like, oh yeah, it's also really important for population growth, right? Then it would be coded with both. That's just to note that these percentages might add to more than 100%. All right, what do we see? We see lots of variation. All right, we see about 40% of students who are using these really vague responses. But look at this, over 30% of students are talking about very specific ways they do math in the science research process. Okay, post-survey, we do see some shifts. So we see a slight reduction up here in these broad, vague responses, and we see a lot more students talking about specific science process skills and specific problems that require math. And so if we actually look within science process skills, it's kind of interesting to break this down because in the pre-survey, they are almost all of them talking about data analysis. And this makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's really intuitive to think about, oh yeah, I'm gonna use math in the data analysis process of like when I'm doing science. And in the post-survey, we see an even breakdown between data analysis, mathematical modeling, and making predictions. And so what we're seeing here is that students are really able to expand the ways that they're seeing how math is used in our discipline. And so what I take away from this is that if you just ask students if math is important to biology, they're going to say yes. But I don't think they really know how. And so it becomes our job to like teach them this, right? We have to show them how it can be used. And I do think that these interdisciplinary courses are a really powerful way to do this. I will also acknowledge there are some real logistical challenges to creating interdisciplinary courses on a campus. And so I also want to talk about some other things we can think about doing in our own biology classes where we have more autonomy. And so I'm going to switch now to talking about another study we've done. This is an intro bio class. And we looked at how we can build student confidence for quantitative tasks. So this study is really rooted in self-efficacy theory. And self-efficacy is very similar to the construct of expectancies of success. In fact, it's often used as a proxy for measuring expectancies of success because self-efficacy is a student's confidence in their ability to successfully do a task or solve a problem. And self-efficacy has a really rich history of theory. It's posited that there are 4 sources of self-efficacy, or 4 ways that kind of students are like picking up on information and weighing information in a way that will either increase their self-efficacy for being able to do a task or decrease their self-efficacy for being able to do a task. So the first source of self-efficacy, these are mastery experiences. This is when a student does a task and then they make judgments of success after completing a task. So, they do a task and they feel like they've successfully completed it. And so they're like, oh yeah, well now my self-efficacy is greater because I'm sure I can do these in the future. This is thought to be the most powerful form of self-efficacy, right? Because it provides direct evidence to a student of whether or not they can do something. A second source of self-efficacy is vicarious experiences. This is based on peer comparisons. So as an example, you can think like if I'm a student, maybe I'm sitting in a class, and there's another student over there and they're solving a problem and they're really like me and I'm watching them solve it. I'm like, oh yeah, that doesn't look so bad. And I'm like them. So if they can do it, I can do it too. All right, so that would increase my self-efficacy. Third source of self-efficacy is social persuasions. This is the feedback that students get while working on tasks. And so if we're thinking about increasing self-efficacy, it would be like the support and encouragement that they're getting while they're doing tasks. And the last source of self-efficacy is physiological and affective states. It is mostly talked about in terms of decreasing self-efficacy. It's often talked about in the context of stress and anxiety that tasks induce that really gets in the way of a student feeling confident that they can complete a task. So, in my intro bio class, I do a lot of group work. And I started to wonder how these sources of self-efficacy might be playing out during group work. Because students are in group work, they're doing a task, they're doing a quantitative task, so there's lots of opportunities for mastery experiences. Students are working with each other, so there's lots of opportunities for vicarious experiences, there's lots of opportunities for social persuasions. There's also opportunities for social persuasions from undergraduate learning assistants who are walking around the classroom, a graduate TA, the instructor, all of whom are interacting with the student groups. And so I wanted to know, how can we really leverage group work to increase the student's self-efficacy for quantitative problems? What is it about group work that we might think about that could help build self-efficacy? And so this is work that I did with a former master's student, Alexander Kulaki. So to look at this, we did pre and post surveys around 2 quantitative group work assignments, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, very popular topic, and population growth. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium occurs very early in the semester. Population growth occurs very late in the semester, and in both cases, students have like a lecture on the topic, and then they have a group work activity that they need to do. And so we asked them this one item before they engaged in group work. It was rate your confidence in your ability to successfully, and it was either solve a Hardy-Weinberg problem or solve a population growth problem. And they did not have to actually answer this, right? They just had to rate their confidence on a scale from 1, not at all confident, to 5, completely confident. We also asked the same item on a post survey, which they had to complete within 3 days of the group work experience. Additionally, on the post survey, we had this open response question. Describe any experiences and or interactions during group work today that increased your confidence in your ability to solve the problem, whatever problem that was. The first thing we did was we looked to see, well, on average, does self-efficacy increase after participating in group work? And we were very satisfied with the answer to this because, in fact, it does significantly increase in the case of both Hardy-Weinberg and population growth. And so we went about inductively coding the responses that students had provided to that open response about the different experiences that increase their self-efficacy. We came up with 9 different codes, including a code no impact, right? These are the students who are like, nothing increased my self-efficacy today, which is legitimate. But a lot of the, for these codes, they're pretty equally distributed between the 2 different question types. And one of the most prevalent codes was something we called accomplishing it, right? So this is where the student talked about actually how just doing the problems was helpful. So practicing, right? That was a key word here. Practicing using given data to calculate growth rates and applying carried capacity to the population, to the logistic growth model. So this aligns really nicely with that mastery experience. This is that mastery experience. And so students are, doing the problem, feeling good about it, and they're like, yeah, I can do this in the future. All right. So another very prevalent code we had was discussing the problem. We actually ended up grouping discussing the problem, being taught how to do the problem, and asking questions about the problem into one larger category called getting help from peers, because these were all just slightly different forms of getting help from peers. And so a quote from this is, being able to work with someone helped because we could share ideas on how to solve the problem. All right, so I mean, this isn't exactly aligned with one of those sources of self-efficacy, but my hypothesis is that this, like, sharing ideas, being taught how to do a problem, asking questions is helping them achieve that mastery experience, right, that can be so powerful. Another common code we had, well, somewhat common code, was confirming answers. This is where an example quote from this, calculating the same answers as my other group mates. So this one was interesting to us because, again, we see a mastery experience. Oh my gosh, that's a theme. But we see it combined with a vicarious experience here. So here they're doing the problem, they're making judgments of success, but those judgments of success are based on comparisons with their peers. The last one is that I'm going to go over is teaching others. This one we did not actually find very commonly, but I do like this quote and just want to share it with you. So I helped one of our group members. This helped me by extension, as I know I'm able to do these problems well enough as I can explain them to others. I love this quote because this is what I want to be happening during all of my group work, right? It's another mastery experience, but here, right, you have the students who feel confident, who are coming in kind of maybe knowing how to do these things, and they're actually explaining it to everyone else, and then they're reflecting on that, right? And they're thinking about, oh, wow, because I could explain it, that means I know it really well, right? But we actually don't see that happening very often, sadly, in our class. This is where we want to get to. All right, so we had all of this data on the different experiences that students were reporting increase their self-efficacy. We also had data, remember, on their initial self-efficacy before they even started this group work. So we actually were interested in knowing, how does a student's initial self-efficacy, how do they feel going into this group work? How does that relate to which experiences they're actually using in this classroom? So we could not look at that with all of these codes. We just didn't have big enough sample sizes for some of these. We did look for a relationship between initial self-efficacy and the probability students use confirming their answers to increase their self-efficacy. No relationship. But we did find relationships between students' initial self-efficacy and the probability they're reporting accomplishing it increases their self-efficacy, or the probability that they are reporting getting help from peers increases their self-efficacy. And we see students who are pretty confident. They are going in to this and like really using that mastery experience to increase their confidence. Whereas, perhaps not surprisingly, students who are not confident, right, they're really relying on their peers for help. And so from this study, one of the main things I take away is just how important mastery experiences are. You know, having those opportunities for practice. And in our case, it was particularly important for students with high self-efficacy for increasing it further, right? They do the problem, and it just kind of confirms, I think, what they already are feeling. But you know, mastery experiences can be given in lots of ways. You don't have to use group work to do a mastery experience. You can just give homework problems, right? And students can have a mastery experience that way. But I think the real power of group work is it gives students that space for peer support, right? And that was really important for helping those students who did not have high self-efficacy for those quantitative problems. And again, my hypothesis is that it's helping them kind of get through those problems and achieve that mastery experience. All right, so the last study that I'm going to talk about, this is something that we are truly in the middle of doing right now. We have only analyzed about half of the data. But I thought it would be fun. It's always fun to kind of give a sneak peek of like really current research. And so it's a little bit different, right? Because we're looking at programming tasks, but we're looking at how course components relate to students' values and confidence for our programming tasks. And I have to give a shout out here to Faith, because this is my grad student, Faith Frings. If anyone knows Faith, she has this intense, deep passion and love for R. I've never seen this before. Loves R so much, and so has crafted an entire dissertation around R. And so one of her questions is, how do course components play a role in students' task values and self-beliefs for programming? And she is actually using a really unique course to study this. So it is a 2-week intensive summer data science course. And the 2 weeks are structured really differently. So the first week is virtual. And so students are learning R through synchronous virtual lectures and activities, and they have daily homework assignments that they have to complete on their own. But the second week is in person, overnight at a field station, very intense. And here they are collecting data on ongoing marine science projects. And what they do is they collect the data, and then eventually they're going to pick a data set, develop a hypothesis, analyze the data with all those R skills they've learned, and then they have to present their findings both orally and through a paper. And so what Faith does is she gives a survey at the very beginning of the week, and then she does semi-structured interviews with students. First at the end of that virtual week, and then again at the end of that in-person week, in order to kind of hear about their experiences during these particular weeks. So again, halfway through this, so we don't have a ton of themes yet. But one thing we seem to be consistently finding, even in our smallish data set that we've analyzed, is how important authentic data, particularly raw, messy data, is for helping students perceive value and learning R. So I'm going to pop up a quote from a student. The student was asked what was useful about the course, and this is at the end of the second week. And they said, just learning to clean up data, because we were actually working with raw data for the first time and got to see how messy it actually is. How to clean up data and make it easier to work with, right? So the student, first of all, is implying that they haven't really worked with raw, real, messy data before. And raw, real, messy data is like science, right? That is a huge part of being a biologist and doing science. And so, seeing this, seeing how it's really done, right? This is actually helping them really value those R programming skills. The student contrasts Excel with R. So anybody can make an Excel sheet and start graphing columns. But as soon as you need to clean that up and take out specific variables, that is way harder. And learning how to make something clean, organized, easy to access, that is a skill that everybody should learn and have in their inventory because it is advantageous. Right? So again, we see that this data cleaning process, this data wrangling process, is really helping them see this value for learning R. So another kind of preliminary theme we're finding is that that final project was really important for building students' confidence in their programming skills. And this seems to be linked to the fact it was a challenging task. So this student that I'm going to pop up, the student contrasts the assignments they were doing during that first virtual week with that final project. So before, meaning during the first week, we were just taking a pre-made RMD document and just editing it or going into it, answering questions. And this, meaning the research project in the second week, was like we had to do everything from scratch. But it was challenging because we've never really done that before. I think it made me, like I said, I think it made me a better coder. Now I feel confident that I know more things. So again, we see how impactful mastery experiences are, right? But it's not just any mastery experience. It's this really challenging project that they had to do. That seems to have been really important for making them think about themselves as being a better coder and having more confidence in their coding skills. But it's also interesting to see what the student kind of continues to talk about with the project. So this is the same student just continuing to talk about the final project. I think my group mates were a really big help. We would just have sessions where we would sit together in the Commons for like hours and just work on the project together and ask each other questions. And then the professors just made themselves so accessible all the time. Like we'd be sitting in the Commons and they'd be sitting 2 tables over and they'd come over and help us. So this student attributes their success on this project to both peer and instructor support. And I think what I find really interesting about this is that getting help from peers, getting help from instructors, that doesn't actually diminish this mastery experience they're having that increases their confidence. And so these might be really critical features, right, of ensuring that students get to that mastery experience that we want to help them achieve. All right, so again, that was just a really kind of brief glimpse into the data. But what we're finding so far is that analyzing authentic data sets, right, those raw, messy data sets, as part of a challenging task in particular, right, those can simultaneously increase students' utility value and their self-efficacy for programming in R. But in order to make sure that they are kind of overcoming those challenging tasks, right, there needs to be some peer or instructor support or some way to ensure that they're having that mastery experience. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of try to tie together the results from these 3 studies into just some general implications for teaching. And what I've done is I've just concatenated the results from the studies into one big model. I like to make models. So you can see all the results here. But my first takeaway, I mean, this is something I talk about all the time. We have to show students how quantitative skills are useful to biology. They don't automatically know. They know math is useful to biology, but they don't actually know how it's used, and they certainly don't know the breadth of ways in which it is used, right? And so there's lots of ways we can do this, right? We can do this through interdisciplinary biomath courses, so making biocalculus courses, making biostats courses. Yes, it is hard, it is challenging. There are real logistical challenges at institutions to doing this, but I definitely think this is something worth striving for. I don't understand why we really silo disciplines. Anyway, so that's one place to start. But I think we also need to make sure we're putting quantitative skills in our biology courses, starting at the introductory level and consistently so that students are constantly reminded and seeing all of the different ways in which we use math and biology, right? And what this doesn't mean you saturate your course with a million mathematical models and say, oh, I taught some quantitative reasoning, right? It means thinking intentionally about what quantitative skills are relevant to the courses you're teaching, right, based on the topics and based on the learning objectives. And one place to start doing this is by using real data, using real problems, right, using real models. We saw in our data that it was really important for students to see the value in learning R, and I suspect it's no different, right? I suspect that it will also help in just help students learn and see the value in just quantitative skills generally. And this, right, this is where open science can make a difference, because this is where real data lives, right? So having access to these real data sets, having access to curricular resources built around real data sets, right? This can be really impactful for showing students the value of quantitative skills, while simultaneously helping them develop all of those quantitative skills. All right, so my second takeaway, once you've decided which quantitative skills you want to put into your class, think about how you can design tasks that provide opportunities for impactful mastery experiences. I feel like I'm preaching a little bit to the choir here when I say make sure you give them practice, right? We don't just like lecture about here's a graph and here's what it means, right? And we don't just say here's a population growth model, here's what the variables mean, but we give students opportunities to practice interpreting challenging graphs and practice using the models. And an important part of this is the feedback, all right? Because they need to be able to make accurate judgments of success. And so that feedback becomes a really important part of that. We have to think about how we can scaffold instruction to create challenging tasks, right? So we might start with some kind of basic practice problems, but we want to get them to move beyond that and to think a little bit deeper, right? And we saw that with the R programming data, how important challenging tasks were. Again, this is a place where open science can be really important. We've heard multiple talks where people are talking about how they're using open data for research experiences, right? And so what a great way to create some challenging quantitative tasks, right, than by using open data sets for those. And throughout the process, no matter what, a question we need to ask ourselves is how can we make sure all of our students have access to peers and instructors to enable their support? Because what we don't want to happen is a student to sit there spinning their wheels on a problem, right, and not be able to make any progress. We want them to be able to have access to support that will help them achieve that positive mastery experience. All right, my third takeaway is actually much broader. It is that I actually will hope you consider motivation when thinking about any aspect of your curriculum. I've talked about it in the context of quantitative skills today, but you can think about motivation when you are thinking about designing curriculum for any skill or any topic. We talked a lot about expectancies of success, but thinking about how you might create tasks that have value for students. So how do you make those tasks interesting and enjoyable for your students, right? What are their interests? How do you make students understand how these topics and skills you're teaching them are going to be useful to them? And how can you reduce cost, right? So how can you think about reducing stress and anxiety around particular tasks that you're giving? And ultimately, what I hope is that we move away from discouraging people to put quantitative skills into the introductory classes to having more productive conversations where we can acknowledge the importance of quantitative skills, and our conversations are now more centered around talking about how we can help students learn these challenging skills. And with that, I would just like to acknowledge lots of people who've helped out here, including my lab, undergraduates who are really important in the analysis of the data that I presented today, and collaborators on the projects that I presented. And I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, we have time for questions. All right, I see Ben.
I mean, that's a great question, right? So how do we make that like, there's a lot of cognitive load in learning how to, or it's a lot of, things you need to understand, right, to learn how to do all of those skills. And so I think part of that is support, right? We need to make sure that they have the appropriate support and that we've probably scaffolded that appropriately. I think, oh my gosh, how terrifying would it be to just like be like, here's our messy data set, go analyze it, right? But like, but if we've taught them, okay, here's how you filter out columns, or here's how you mutate columns. So I think it just requires some intentional design to like build them up to that point and make sure there are support structures in place, because they're gonna encounter challenges, and you have to just be there to kind of help them persist through them, and then celebrate their success at the end.
Thank you so much for this talk. So I love this point about recognition from other people, even other students, and helping them build this identity. And I'm curious if you can talk more about the importance of the identity of those other students, or if it's different if it comes from an instructor, or if in the case of a class that doesn't have other students or can't do group work, if that could even be substituted with something like an AI assistant actually giving validation in that same way. I'm like just curious about your thoughts about that.
That is a great question. I've never even thought about AI. I think for that mastery experience, I think whatever validation they can get to help them understand success, whether it's from a peer, whether it's from the instructor, whether it's even from AI, right? If they can, right, any way you can ensure that they feel like they have successfully completed that problem, I think should lead to that mastery experience. I mean, if you think back to self-efficacy theory, some of those other things like social persuasions where you get feedback from others, theoretically that makes a difference where it's coming from, and theoretically kind of more people with more recognition, like your instructor, would have more I think power over it. I will say though, that doesn't seem to be what's salient to students, right? What seems to be salient to students is they've done that, right? They've done it successfully, even if they've had to have help along the way. And so that seems to be more powerful in the end. But I don't know, I'd love to know, like AI, I'd love to like know, that's a great research question.
It's also likely to get you funding.
I know. I keep thinking about all the different ways we need to shift towards thinking about AI.
No, I was actually thinking, bringing it back to Bates and Carrie's work and all of that stuff, because I was really intrigued by that, because we had a biomedical informatics program that was designed where the bio students were effectively just taking math courses with math faculty, and it was obviously designed to fail, whatever. But what I was thinking about was the opportunity in an intro bio class where you have potentially other types of majors in there with the bio students. And so we have that problem at my school where we have math, CS, all types of non-bio majors taking our intro classes, right? And they will often say, I don't see the relevance of bio and why I have to take this class. So I was wondering if you could do a kind of a reciprocal kind of study where you looked at quantitative opportunities, quantitative things, with the bio students doing it and then having the math students potentially doing it, and if there'd be a kind of a reciprocal kind of relationship between those two.
Yeah, like with the more CS students seeing the relevance of the biology.
Yeah, and have the biology.
I mean, that's a real challenge when there are non-majors in courses. We do have that challenge at UNH too. I don't know, there's lots of reasons for and against having majors and non-majors, but which is a whole nother debate, actually we shouldn't go near. But it does create a challenge in even within, I will say, the discipline of biology, there can be many different interests, because there can be pre-med students and environmental students. I had this one brilliant idea one year where I was going to create essentially isomorphic assignments, but one was going to be in a medical context and one was going to be in an environmental context. And before I even got anywhere, I was like, that is so much work. I will never have time to do that. But that was my brilliant idea for trying to solve it. But it would be so cool. Also, I thought it would be a really cool study. Yeah, so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that you probably would see how do you make that relevant to these other students in your classes? Oh, but you know what might help that is Sensor. I've heard about this program, Sensor.
Well.
And how they try to put societal issues into classes to make it relevant to everyone.
Making everybody do Sensor is the trick.
Hi, I had a quick question about specifically teaching quantitative skills to bio students at the introductory level. Thinking about how students enter college and might take Intro Bio 1 their first semester with a whole variety of different math backgrounds, let alone whether or not they identify as a math person or not, having different levels of algebraic knowledge, of data visualization knowledge. So I was wondering if that's something that you've considered, or if that's something that you have thoughts on.
Oh, I think about that a lot, right? Because, I mean, if there's anything about the 200-person or whatever large intro class you teach, right? It's that there's a lot of variability there. And so I'm going to be honest, like that doesn't make me not want to teach quantitative skills, but it does make me, so I have actually developed just like additional resources that I try and post around that on my Canvas site. Probably more resources than I post about other topics. For instance, I actually had my grad student create a whole guide to the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium problem that is like it's like a non-scary guide. It's humorous, so we post that. And then, but you know what though? Students have a lot of really good math intuition, and you can tap into it. So like, I will tell you, I mean, I was really proud of this. This year, I changed my Hardy-Weinberg. Okay, everyone is like, why do you even teach Hardy-Weinberg? I love population genetics, so I think Hardy-Weinberg is actually kind of interesting. So I was like, I'm going to teach Hardy-Weinberg differently this year, and so because they have intuition about probability, which is what it's all based on, and so you can tap that intuition. And they built the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium model, right, from just me prompting them with the right questions. And I'm not going to lie, it still didn't really seem to help them solve the problems eventually. There's still a little bit of a disconnect. We're working on it. But like, I think that, and especially if you give them some time to like talk, there's a lot of talking during these classes. Like, talk to your neighbor. Let's talk about it. Like, so I think that if you do it maybe gently, I don't know if that's the right word, or you're cognizant of the fact that they're not all coming from the same background, right? But that also means that you have to assume maybe you're going to start really basic and build them up from there. I try not to assume that they know too much.
I have a question specifically about the peer groups. Do you let them self-organize? Are they sometimes not effective? I'm thinking when I was taking physics, I studied with two friends. We were a great study group. We knew each other, we trusted each other. What one of us understood, another one didn't. What that person understood, maybe I didn't. We were really a very collaborative group, and we really helped each other a lot. I don't know that I could have gotten that same understanding with a different group of people, maybe people I didn't know or someone who didn't contribute as much.
Yeah, so this is a good question. So the way I do the way I did these groups for this study is actually different than the way I do them now. For this study, I actually purposefully so students did a pre-test on the topics I was going to teach. And then I organized them by their scores, so that each group had about 4 students, and it was someone who was kind of in the top quartile, the bottom quartile, and then 2 people in the middle quartiles. So that was very strategic, and that was actually how I'd always kind of organized my groups up through that point. And I actually I will say I like that because I changed things, so I don't like this as much. The reason I changed things is because it took a lot of time to do that. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to make my life so much easier if I just have students choose their own groups. And so I do that now, and I find I actually have more problems. In fact, I just read my course evals the other day, and one person said, could you please randomize the groups? But I had this brilliant idea to start using ChatGPT to do this, because I think it might actually let me do it very faster. And then Carlos told me about a new program called Grouper that it's free, that you can use to create groups. So I think I'm going to go back to creating groups randomly because, or at least, or maybe if I can stratify on this pre-test scores, I'm going to do it probably, because I actually like those groups better. Because what happens is sometimes when they form their own groups, like 3 people who know each other really well form a group, a 4th person joins, and it's like terrible for that one person. And then they do keep the groups all semester. My goal is for them to kind of build a community with that group over the course of the semester. But certainly if there are major problems, there are ways they can kind of change their groups. Did I answer your question fully? Okay.
All right, that is the time that we have. Thank you so much, Melissa.